By one.
Okay, recording.
Today is the 1st of July, 2024. My name is Kate Feld. I am interviewing Thomas Comolli on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation. The interview is taking place in Wilmslow, United Kingdom. The language of the interview will be English.
Thomas, you can pull it down now. Yeah, just put it on the floor. That's it, thank you.
Okay, so
Get rid of my sweet.
could you please state your name?
Let me focus up first.
Okay.
Am I looking at you or the camera?
Yeah, ignore me, look at Kate all the time.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So, please state your name.
Thomas Comolli.
Do you have any other names?
Well, in Hungary at birth, I used to be called Tamás, or my family called me Tommy.
And middle names?
Originally at birth was János. In England, I took on John. Again, I don't use it.
Just repeat the from the start again.
Okay. So just the introduction. Please state your name.
Yeah.
So, could you please state your name?
Thomas Comolli.
Do you have any other names?
At birth in Hungary, it was Tamás. Family and friends called me Tommy.
Any?
And I have a middle name at birth, János, which turned into John in England, which I don't use at all.
So what did people call you when you were growing up? Did you have any nicknames?
Well, while I was growing up, everybody called me Tommy. When I went to school, my Hungarian name actually has a meaning which is serious. But because I wasn't all that serious, I laughed a lot. My nickname became Smiley, as it were.
What is smiley in Hungarian? What is
Mosolygó.
Mosolygó? Oh, wow. That's wonderful. Is there any special significance to your given name?
Other than my parents thinking with a lot of foresight, I guess, that they wanted to give me English type names because it would one day be useful in the world. And of course, Thomas and the middle name John is pretty acceptable.
Great.
Can we start there? Okay, you're recording.
Okay. Could you please state your name?
Thomas Comolli.
Do you have any other names?
Well, at birth I was called Tamás, and I was given a middle name János, which both got anglicized when I came to Britain, Thomas and John. And my family and friends always called me Tommy.
And did you have any other nicknames?
Well, my family name in Hungarian actually means serious. So because I was laughing a lot at school, very soon they started calling me Mosolygó in Hungarian, which translates into smiley in English.
Great. Smiley serious. Is there any special significance to your given name?
Only to the extent that my parents, with a lot of foresight, I guess, thought that international names would be useful in the future, and they wanted to give me English-sounding names, and hence Thomas and John.
Now, what is your birth date?
10th of November, 1936.
And what's the place of your birth?
In Budapest.
Do you know the address?
At my birth, I'm not sure. I know the address where I grew up in the in pre-war years. I'm not sure if that was the address at birth.
Okay, what's the address of where you grew up?
That was a funny name, Tűzharcosa kutya 35, in one of the suburbs.
Great. And who were your parents?
My parents, my father was Alfred Komoly, and my mother was Margit. Her friends called her Manzi. And maybe worth mentioning that my father and his two brothers were actually born with the name Kohn, which the three of them together decided in 1935 to turn it something more Hungarian sounding, hence Komoly Sirius. And
Right.
In particular for my uncle, or for two of my father's elder brothers who were in public life. And my uncle Otto in particular, who was the leader of the Hungarian Zionists, he thought that a less Jewish sounding name than Kohn would assist him in getting public acceptance in his so-called political activities.
Great. Great. So your siblings, did you have any siblings?
No, I was an
Okay.
only child.
And what about your grandparents? What were their names?
My grandparents was my grandfather was David Kohn,
Mm-hmm.
and my grandmother, for the moment, her maiden name escapes me.
And on the other side?
And on the other side, my mother's father was called Gyula Vámos, and his wife was Käthe Vámos. She came from Vienna, hence the German-sounding name.
So where did your parents meet? Do you know?
I have no idea.
Know how they met? No?
No.
Okay. And do you know where each branch of the family came from?
I think my paternal side came from Croatia, but they had some links to Prague as well, which I have never explored. And on my mother's side, again, I know that my grandfather, I think, had more of a Hungarian origin, but my grandmother came from quite a well-known Austro-Hungarian family, Kotányi, that were quite well known. They gave their name to a brand of paprika in Hungary.
Wow. Great. So I want to talk now a little bit about before the war, before the conflict,
Sure.
what your family life was like. How was living in your house as a child? What do you remember of that?
Well, it was fairly modest accommodation. We lived in a kind of suburban small house. I guess we were probably renting the bottom floor apartment, which had one large living room, a small dining room, and a large living room. And I remember my small bed, so I'm probably talking about being 3-4 years old. My cot was in the bedroom where my mother slept, and my father, presumably in order not to upset both of us, in early mornings when he went off to work, he had a kind of settee in the living room, and that's where he slept. And it was also the place where they would have guests and the like. My closest memory is to the dining room, where I recall being made to eat certain foods I wasn't so keen on, and I can just picture not so much the table but the floor underneath, which there was a kind of red rug which I kept staring at in despair. But,
What were the foods you didn't want to eat? Do you remember?
I think it was spinach, not unusual for that age.
It's always spinach, isn't it? So did your parents have a lot of visitors and friends and relatives coming to the house?
I think they had some evening guests, because some of my memories from that time relate to having listened to some of the news on the radio previously, and I was allowed for a short time to mix with the guests. Wow. And from the news, I remembered the name. I think he was an interior minister with a double-barreled name. And I used to tell my parents to amuse them that this man, and I repeated the name, is a real idiot. And they made me repeat it in front of the guests, and I kind of brought the house down. That is my one memory from that period.
That sounds very funny. Gosh, how great. So did your parents listen to the radio a lot?
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm talking now about sometime between 40 and 43.
Right.
So it was becoming an immensely political period, because that's when the right-wing government in Hungary, I can't say that they brought in the intensified anti-Jewish laws that have been around since the 20s. And so Jewish families would have been very keen to listen to the news, to find out about developments.
Of course, of course. What were your parents' personalities like?
Well, it was the kind of, in those days, I guess the usual setup. My father was the wage earner. He inherited from my grandfather the family business, which was scrap metal, and he had a small yard, and so he would go out. I guess it was 6 days a week, and disappear very early in the morning and came home quite late. And my mother was a housewife, so my time would mostly be spent with her. Mm. I would be with the two of them, maybe Sundays and holidays. And
what was food like in your house? Did you keep kosher or no?
No, the only bit I remember about kashrut, remember is the wrong way of putting it. The only thing I learned about it is my oldest cousin told me that in my paternal grandparents' home, they always had kosher food, but they weren't strictly observant. They were not Shomer Shabbat, and my mother's family were not particularly observant in any respect.
Okay.
And then in our own household, my mother's standards really came to to be the accepted standard.
Right, of course. Did your parents have a good sense of humor? Do you remember jokes and
Yes,
things?
humor is always an important issue in Hungarian Jewish families. In general, I think humor is a very important part of life.
Yeah. So do you remember them reading or enjoying music, telling stories?
Not really.
No.
From those years, to my surprise and to the surprise of some of my cousins who have more live memories, I remember very little. Apart from what I told you a few minutes ago, and a couple of snapshots from growing up, my memories really start from 1944.
Okay. And do you remember celebrating birthdays or holidays or anything like that?
Well, I remember that birthdays were an event, but I don't remember birthday cakes or parties or anything of the sort.
Okay. And did your parents follow sport or anything like that?
I don't think so.
No. Okay. And did they have sort of a group of friends that do you remember that they spent time with?
I'm now kind of interpolating from the fact that post-war, I don't recall meeting anybody where my mother would have said, this is a pre-war friend.
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like they had a fairly close...
They had a tight circle.
Yeah, a tight
probably.
circle, yep.
And of course, with the history of Hungary, many of those would have perished.
That's right. That's right. So you say that, yeah, your family wasn't particularly observant. Did they go to synagogue at all?
I don't remember going to synagogue at all.
Okay. And you don't have memories of religious holidays or anything like that? Okay.
The only one very slight memory is one Seder night. I recall going to my Uncle Otto's place in town. And the only reason I remember it is because when the evening was over, we were getting ready to leave, and they had this large entrance hall in their apartment, and my uncle picked me up and put me sitting on top of a small wardrobe where the coats were kept. And I wasn't at all pleased. I started kicking and screaming, and he quickly took me down. But I don't actually remember the Seder night at all.
Great. So, in terms of education, what level of school had your parents attended? Do you know?
I know that my mother attended, I only know this from what happened post-war, that she attended a kind of commercial training college where she learned bookkeeping. My father, he probably would have done what in Hungary they called elementary school and some kind of high school, but he never went to university because he had to take over the business. My grandfather passed away in the 30s.
Okay. And was the business, was it doing well, do you know, or was it having a tough time?
I don't think that was a business that gave you a fantastic living.
No. Okay.
He had about 4 or 5 employees, and that was about it.
So he worked at the shop, and then people collected scrap metal and brought it to him there.
Well, it was both buying and selling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you remember having treats or anything like that when you were a child, in terms of the standard of living did you feel comfortable when you were growing up?
I don't think I was ever missing anything.
Right.
I don't recall people telling me that I must wear something 2 days running because we can't afford a change of clothing or any such thing. And I don't remember anything about food being short.
Mm.
So it was kind of a lower middle class existence, I guess, trying to keep to the middle class standards without really having the good income to splash out on anything.
Yeah. Do you remember having toys when you were growing up? When you were very little?
I only remember one particular toy, which I guess I got as a birthday present. Such there was I call it Hungarian equivalent. It was really a German equivalent of Meccano, which is a construction set of metal bits and pieces, and my father would sit down with me to show me how to handle a screwdriver and a spanner in assembling the bits and pieces, and probably that led to my, if you want to call it a decision, when I was asked at that age what I want to become when I grow up, and I said either an engineer or a chef. I don't know where the chef bit came from, but it's interesting that I did become an engineer, and cooking became a very strong hobby. It became a necessity when I came to this country, but it also became a hobby.
Wonderful. Do you remember being involved in any children's groups or children's play activities or anything like that?
No, nothing at all.
Okay. Do you remember your parents? Do you know if they read newspapers and?
I don't know.
Yeah, you don't know. Or do you know if they were politically active or interested?
I don't suppose they were.
Okay. And what do you remember about the community that you lived in? What was it like just around?
I mean, all the questions you're asking me can be answered on the heading I mentioned, that there's a period of life that I have very few memories from.
Okay, that's no problem. So you don't remember going to any parks or any streets or any shops?
And any memories I have are from photos that one way or another came into my possession, which I used in very recent years to assemble a kind of biography of myself for other people.
Great. And were there any important people in your life, from then, that time, besides your parents? You mentioned your uncle.
Well,
yeah.
The most important person would be my uncle. I can mention the other brother, who became chief engineer of the Hungarian Shell.
What were their names again? Sorry.
Lajos was the middle brother, and Otto the oldest. And Otto took over the torch, as it were, from his father, who was a founder member of the Hungarian Zionist organization, and in fact one of the founder member of the International Zionist organization. I know he was at the first Congress in Basel, and my uncle became, from the early 40s, the president of the Hungarian Zionists, and he has quite a story going on from there, both in the strictly Jewish sense and also in the political sense, of which I have a lot more I could tell you. I just published a book about him.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk about that when we get up to that part of the war, if that would be okay. So just finishing up with the pre-war period, now moving on to the changes, you know, with the conflict kind of heating up there as a presence in your lives. What do you remember? Do you have any awareness of changes happening for you and your family?
While we were in the suburban apartment, I don't remember anything changing. So my first memory really, and I'm using my historical knowledge because I've done quite a bit of research into that period. The date would have been June 1944, when the government edict came to concentrate the Budapest Jewish population into some 2,000 apartment blocks. And they were giving every family an allowance of 5 square meters per person. And to some extent, luckily, an aunt of mine and her aunt had a one-bedroom apartment in one of these nominated buildings, which was too big for them. So by letting the two of us, my mother and I, join them in the apartment, we just about qualified for the 20 square meters, and we moved in there. Okay. And that is really where my memories start.
Okay. And where was your father at this time?
My father, I think earlier than that, had been called up, one could say, into the Hungarian army, but that is a simplification because there was conscription at the time, but the government would not dare to give arms to Jewish men. So all men between the ages of 16 and 60 were enlisted into, the name translates into forced labor units.
Okay.
And so he really went out of our lives at that time, sometime in 43. And after that, I only saw him once more for a couple of days.
When was it that you saw him?
He came back in 1944, to be precise, and I have evidence for that from my uncle's diary. He came back on the 7th of November 1944 with a permit from his commanding officer, who wanted to do my father a bit of a favor and gave him a 3-day leave with documentation and all. And he turned up, he found out where we were living, turned up and joined us at the bath and all the rest of it. There was great joy all around. But in these apartment buildings, at the main entrance to the house, there was always a janitor, concierge, whose job it was to keep a tab on all occupants in the building, and he had list of names and all the rest of it. And when he saw the additional person, he got very worried that it would be his responsibility for letting him in, and took it upon himself to inform the Hungarian fascist party. The name translates into the Arrow Cross. Went to the nearest office and told them about my father. And they sent around a couple of armed guys and took him away. And my mother tried to save him. And I think she managed to meet him once in a kind of gathering place at the main synagogue. And after that, my father disappeared. We were never quite sure whether he had been taken to one of the camps, like Bergen-Belsen, which was the most likely place, or possibly, like it happened to some tens of thousands of Jewish people in Budapest, taken to the River Danube embankments and shot and thrown into the river. But we never heard. My mother put in a search with the International Red Cross, hoping that somebody came across him in the camps, but we never got any response.
So what do you remember being told about where he went when he went to work in the labor unit, and after that? Did you have any knowledge of what happened to him?
We had no knowledge, and really my knowledge again comes from post-war research.
Okay. But do you remember your mother telling you anything about it?
Well, I remember that it was a matter of receiving the odd postcard or letter and hearing about heart conditions, and at the same time that they had to do all the hard physical labor of digging trenches and all the rest of it, carrying stuff for everybody else. But they were at the same time exposed on the Russian front to the same dangers as all the soldiers. So it was apart from all the everyday hardships, it was also a life-threatening situation. He could have been shot by enemy fire or artillery, whatever, any day. So it was always a question for my mother of waiting for the next piece of news arriving.
And do you know how old he was during that time?
Well, he would have been, he was born in 1996, so he would have been 48.
Okay. Wow.
He had a pretty tough time, and that generation generally, because in the First World War, he was also on the Russian front and captured and taken to a POW camp in Siberia. And he came back with severe physical damage. I think he had scurvy and all kinds of other problems.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds pretty horrible. So, getting back to you and your mother now,
Yeah.
You were living in, was this the Gold Star?
Star of David was
Yeah.
on the entrance to the building. There was a large yellow Star of David that was a compulsory sign, much the same as we had individually. It was compulsory when we went on the street to wear a yellow Star of David on your lapel. All right.
So we'll go back to the Star of David house.
Where do we restart?
I think I asked about the Star of David house. So you were living in that apartment building. You were saying it had a Star of David over the door. Is that right?
Correct. The regulation was that at the building entrance there had to be a large yellow Star of David, and that reflected what was a personal requirement, that from the age of, I think, 6 upwards, we all had to wear a yellow star on our outer garments if we ever got out onto the street, which was not all that often, because soon after moving into the building, there was a curfew introduced, and we were only allowed to go out for 3 hours a day, between 2 and 5. And if you were unlucky not to have a doctor or a dentist in your building, you probably would have to go without any medical attention for God knows how long.
Wow. Now, had you started school before moving to this house?
Yes, I probably had a year and a bit in an elementary school in the suburb where we lived, but that was stopped, I think, quite a bit before our move.
Okay.
And of course, once we were in the Yellow Star house, there was no chance of education of any description.
Were you sad about missing school?
It wasn't just being sad because I always liked school. It was also a time filler. And by not having school and not having taken much with us, or able to take with us in the way of toys, there was, relatively speaking, little to do all day long. For some reason, I don't remember ever meeting another boy of my age or similar age in the building. So although there was a big courtyard where under more favorable conditions I might have been playing football or some other games, there was none of that available. The only, apart from the one toy I remember taking with me was the Märklin, the metal assembly game. But the only other entertainment I had in the apartment opposite us on the same floor, there was a teenage girl who had the Hungarian equivalent of Monopoly, and she was probably equally bored, and possibly once a day, or maybe not quite as frequently, she would condescend to play with me, and we had games after games after games. I became quite good at it. Obviously, if I was a match for her, it sharpened my commercial instincts a little bit. But no other entertainment, and no children's books either. I think I had to rely on conversations with my mother and aunt and great aunt, who tried to spend some time with me.
Were you able to read at that point?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, but there wasn't much to read, so
No, not
you
really.
didn't get much practice.
Whatever books they had, I guess they would filter it to see if they can give me anything, but I don't actually remember reading anything.
So, where did you sleep in that apartment?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I guess my aunt and great aunt would have shared the bedroom, and my mother and I would have slept somehow or other in the living room.
Now, was it easy to get food at this time? Do you know? How was the food?
That is quite a long story, because food as for everybody else, at that time, food was rationed in Hungary, and they would give you coupons to cash in every month. But the coupons, as I found looking at some documents, for Jewish people were different from the rest of the population. The meat coupon, I have a picture somewhere, actually said on the Jewish meat coupon, which of course was less than what other people were getting. And the same went for eggs and flour and sugar and fats and all the rest of it. And by this time, because my father's earnings had disappeared, my mother tried to provide some income for us, which we needed, and she started baking. And the ingredients for baking had to come out of our allowances, so there was less of that available. And I kind of much later I developed a bit of a guilty feeling for rejoicing at the time any time she would drop a biscuit on the floor, because a broken biscuit couldn't be sold. So that would become my benefit at the time. But it was tough times.
Who did she sell this baking to?
I'm not even sure if it was for selling to other Jewish people who had more money or anybody else, because food was an issue. This is, we're talking about 44, by which time the Eastern Front, the Russian army, was approaching Hungary. And things were getting tighter and tighter.
So did you have a radio in this flat?
No, because one of the early government anti-Jewish legislation by the Hungarian government was to, generally they were confiscating a lot of Jewish property, but in particular they confiscated radios and telephones, the idea being to keep us out of communication. And the only thing I remember about news, and that is quite a sharp memory. By this time, the Allies, the British and the American, started bombing raids of Budapest. And whenever there was a raid, the sirens would sound. And in these big apartment blocks, there was a very extensive basement, normally used for storage of firewood and coal and the like. And each apartment had an allocated cubicle. And we would all have some mattresses and blankets in case we had to go and stay for a longer period or even sleep there. Some of the raids were being at night. I know it was the British bombing at night. I can still recognize the noise that a Lancaster bomber makes. And I could tell the difference between that and the Americans who came during the day. And I saw a film not so long ago and I said, I remember that noise. And anyway, while during those raids, I noticed that the grown-ups were kind of huddling together in one space. And I could see all these heavy overcoats, and I would creep up behind them to see what was going on. And somebody must have hidden a radio, and they were listening on the radio to the BBC or the Voice of America Hungarian language broadcast, which of course was also forbidden. and that was the only source of news information that we had at the time.
So news must have been passed by word of mouth.
From then on, it would be word
Yeah.
of mouth, yes.
Wow. Do you remember your mother telling you anything about the news?
Well, only I guess it was the encouraging bits which would be passed on to a child. I was by this time coming to 8 years old. In fact, the date when my father was taken away was three days before my birthday. So there wasn't a big celebration. And if we had some encouraging news, that would be spread around and discussed. But there wasn't a lot of that.
No. Shall we take a break now?
Good. Disconnected or just loose?
It just fell down, so that's fine. It's a good time to take a break. It's been a
Okay.
So
How long has it? Right.
Okay, recording.
okay. So we're talking about what your life was like in the Star of David house.
Yes.
With your mother and your aunt and
Yeah.
your great aunt. So at that time, you weren't really seeing any kids. You were in the apartment most of the day on your own. And how long did you live in that place?
Trying to interpolate between various dates, we were there from June 1944 until late in November. I'm not sure exactly what date.
Now, do you remember anything changing during that time when you were living there in terms of your conditions, or was there a sense of, you said things were getting tougher and tougher. Did you see that in any way yourself?
I don't think it manifested itself in anything that I experienced. It was, I know that things outside were getting worse, but that was in terms of people being rounded up and taken away on deportation trains and the like, which my mother and the adults would have been well aware of, but it really didn't affect the way I was living at the time.
Did they tell you about things like deportations?
No.
No. Okay.
I may have caught bits of conversation, but nobody sat down to explain to me what was the threat in the outside world.
Okay. Okay. Now, what was the address of this place?
It was a street called Ötvösutca, number 27. I remember the number from post-war discussions.
Okay. And so at what point did you leave that accommodation?
Well, I think it was prompted by the fact that round about this time, the news came out that the government, by this time the government actually was taken over by the Hungarian fascists, and they were now setting up a ghetto in what used to be the poorest and most concentrated Jewish area in the middle of town. And the ghetto started off from the very beginning being very deprived, not only in terms of food and the medication, but also the crowdedness, and there was quite a lot of disease. I think typhus started, and my mother was very determined not to be taken there as the next phase. And she appealed to my uncle, who in his work for the Zionists, and he also been adopted by that time by the International Red Cross. He had those connections and the diplomatic connections, and asked him if he could find a hiding place for us out of the Yellow Star House and avoiding the ghetto. And he came up with this possibility in a suburban house, 3 or 4 bedroom house. And I know roughly the district, but I'm not too sure about the street address. And we packed even fewer belongings than we brought to the Yellow Star House, because we knew it was going to be very tight. And we moved at the end of November to what must have been quite an affluent house in its original form. But when you have 35 or 40 people in a house that size, where people fight for territory to sleep at night, and of course for using kitchen and the bathroom and the toilet, it's pretty tough there. And it was not a nice environment when people have, to some extent, have to rely on each other, but they also have to fight everybody for the living space. It doesn't get very nice. My one ongoing memory, it keeps coming back, of what situations like this turn human behavior into. There was an old man who spent longer in the toilet than would have been expected by others. And there was this young woman who wanted to get in there, and she started screaming at him to get out and not to mess around for so long. And it's a kind of unavoidable human degradation that stayed with me ever since. And it's not something I discussed a lot. I don't think I mentioned it to my mother even later on. But it was really, really tough there. And my mother, again, because we needed the money, she still tried to continue with her baking. And she never told me at the time, but must be a good 20 years after the war. By this time she was living with me in London. Somehow the discussion came to that place and those periods. And she told me that while she was delivering her product, she got stopped on the street by the Arrow Cross and taken to a collection place, and from which were the collection places for the trains that were deporting people to Auschwitz. And when they started marching them towards the railways, she decided she had to do something. Number one, she realized what fate awaited her. But equally importantly from her point of view was that she left me back at this house with a bunch of strangers. There wasn't a friend or a relative or anybody there, so there would be nobody there to look after me. And in total desperation, she decided to make a run for it. And there were 3 or 4 armed guards who were marching them, who tried to shoot her. But not being trained soldiers, they kept missing. And she did the kind of zigzagging that you would do with a bit of awareness, and kept looking back what was going on behind her. And for me, the most horrifying memory from her memory is that she's telling me that from a group of 200 or 300, it must have been, not one person would try to follow her example, because by this time the mentality was, I think they describe it as the syndrome of the rabbit in the searchlight that freezes. So it's if you do nothing, you will survive. You're still alive. There is life, there is hope, kind of thing. But the moment you start running, you become a target, and you could lose it all. And that kind of stayed with me ever since I heard the story. And when I talk to schools nowadays, I always tell them this story. I hope that they appreciate it.
Wow, that's some story. So you only learned that after
Oh, I said it was roughly 20 years after the event.
Wow.
She came back to the house, never said a word to me, and never said a word after the war.
Wow.
It was her secret for very long.
Wow. So this was a house that was under the protection of the Swedish embassy?
I believe it was a Swedish, but in those days it was the basically the neutral embassies, Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain was neutral at the time, interestingly enough, although it was Franco's Spain. And also there was some protection under the International Red Cross, which my uncle used quite a lot.
Okay. So this house was not a great place for you. And you and your mother, why did you leave and when did you leave?
Well, I know exactly the date when we left, because it was Christmas Eve, 1944. And the reason that we left was because my mother, who must have had an awareness unusual at that time for a lot of people, and normally not credited to housewives. And she reckoned that whatever diplomatic protection we had, the Arrow Cross would not be respecting it ad infinitum. And it was only a question because we would have the same fate as everybody else, taken to the ghetto or taken to the trains. And through her father, she found out about a family in a different suburb on the other side of the river, who might be willing to hide us in their home. And on that evening, she explained to me that we were going what we were going to do. That was the first kind of explanation I remember getting, because she had to tell me, coach me, that we would be taking off the yellow stars from our coats and pack not even everything we had in this sheltered house, just the minimum that would fit into she had a little overnight case, and I gave me a little backpack that would not raise any suspicion that if anybody stopped us on the way, because we had to take public transport, and we would just say we were going to join family for Christmas Eve, and nothing. We don't carry identifications, which in those days would have shown us being Jewish, and we can tell the person who stops us it's only a family visit. We didn't bother to bring identity cards, and I understood at that time that it was something serious, and we in the dark we got onto a tram and went into the unknown, into an unknown address. In those days, of course, there was no navigation or maps or anything of the sort. Just had to brave the outside world in the cold, and ultimately got there. But the one thing I remember, which turned out to be very useful, we had to change trams. And we got off the tram in a fairly busy central place, a central square in Budapest. And she said, just 1 minute before we get on the other tram, we want to go into this shop. And it turned out to be a bookshop. And she found on the shelves a Teach Yourself book, which must have been quite unusual in those days. And it had elementary reading and mathematics. And she bought this book, and we took it with us. And that really became a real saving grace for me, not only because it gave me a chance to spend time, but also because it began to fill the gap which I had over the previous several months of not being schooled. And so anyway, we got to the house, and these people said the only safe place we could be in, because they were very concerned about their own neighbors. Not everybody was as sympathetic to Jews as they were. And we would have to go into the cellar, which was unlit and cold and damp and everything you expect in a cellar. And then in the evenings, when it became dark, they would close their shutters on the windows, and we would be allowed to come up and get a bit warm. They would give us a meal and a bit of food to take down with us for the following day, and I could read my book as well and do a bit of learning. So that was really the highlight of every day.
Do you know their names?
No, I don't remember their family name. What I do remember is the first name. There's a mother and daughter. Their respective husbands must have been in the army. I don't even know if the daughter was married or not. But she was, she must have been, because she was about the same age as my mother. And there's a story about her and my mother after the war anyway, which is a separate chapter. Anyway, I remember her name was Pushy. That is all I recall.
And how did your grandfather get in touch with them? I mean, how did that come about?
That is a bit of a funny story because my grandfather joined a sect of some description. Well, actually, I know what they were called. They called themselves the Jews who believe in Christ.
Okay.
I don't know if anything like that still exists or anything existed outside of Hungary. And that must have been the link for him. As the title describes, they probably had some contact with Christian churches and being introduced to Christian families, and I guess that's how he came across a family sympathetic to Jews.
Okay. And would they have been killed had you been found? Do you know?
Something nasty would have happened to them for sure.
Yeah.
They were certainly risking their freedom at the very least.
So what do you remember about, what did you and your mother do when you were hiding in the cellar?
Sitting in the dark and chatting and trying to, I guess there might have been a little light coming through the cellar. No, you can't call those windows, but I know from here where we live, we have a cellar, and it has a kind of eye-level window where we can get a bit of daylight in. We might have had something like that to read my school book.
So this was the winter.
This
It
was
must
the
have been
winter.
Very cold.
Yeah, and they gave us some blankets to be down there, and I guess we had a mattress or something to sit on, but it can't have been a lot of fun.
No. Do you remember anything of interest happening in the time that you were staying there, or?
The only thing I remember quite painfully, which is a situation I don't share a lot, but for the sake of historical accuracy, you asked me the question. Somehow or other I got worms.
Okay.
And my mother and the lady of the house, between them, worked it out that the way to possibly get rid of that would be to get a lot of steaming hot salt water, and they made me, in the evenings when we were upstairs, they made me sit on this potty in view of 3 women. And I was absolutely and totally embarrassed, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And this is the one memory I have from those days.
Wow.
Not very frightening, but very, very well embarrassing. And at my present age, I can talk about it and laugh. But even when I was 20 and 30 and 40, I wouldn't have dreamt to mention it to anybody.
Well, that must have been mortifying, but it is an indication of the kinds of conditions you had been in. So
yes, they couldn't call a doctor or take me to, because they wouldn't know what the doctor's attitude might be.
right.
He might have told us.
Yeah. Do you remember those women very well?
Well, I have a picture of both of them. I remember going back a year or two after the war, visiting them. That was the last contact with them. But what I do remember from my mother and to some extent my grandmother is after the Russian troops came in, which I haven't mentioned to you so far, but we can come back to that. The daughter and my mother decided that to relieve the hunger, basically. There was very little food around in Budapest at the time. They would try to do some bartering with villages within reach. And how on earth they got the means and how they got the idea, I don't know. But they got a little two-wheeler cart and a donkey to pull it. And the pair of them dressed up in long black skirts and tops to look and made themselves look a lot older, so that they wouldn't be a target for the roaming troops. And they went out taking household goods and pictures and clocks and stuff that would have been considered valuable in the villages. And they came back with a lot of food, which they shared between them. Wow. And then we got something to eat, and they got something to eat, which was quite an important achievement in those days.
So, going back to when the Russians or the Soviets came, what do you remember about that?
What I remember is they turned up. Of course, we were lucky. We must have been on the side of town from which at least one of the Red Army troops approached. So we were liberated earlier than the rest of town. And it was an artillery unit. And they took a liking to a little boy running around, and they communicated me. They gave me a piece of chocolate, which of course was very nice. That's something I haven't seen for who knows how long. And somehow or other we developed some language between us. And whenever they fired their artillery guns against the Germans who were still in the rest of town, that would have been a risk to the windows with the air pressure. And they used me as a messenger. Each time they were ready to fire a salvo, they would send me into the house to say, open the windows. And that saved all the windows from breaking. And I became a very useful attachment to the troops or to the house. I did my useful contribution.
Do you remember, at what time did they arrive? Do you remember anything about that?
No idea. No? They just suddenly turned up, and that was, for us, it was relief. I guess for the people hiding us and for the neighbors, it would have been a very unwelcome presence. But of course, they now turned, our hosts turned to us saying, you have to tell them that you're Jewish, and you have to tell them that we've been helping you. And we did our best. I don't know if we came across somewhere a Russian dictionary or something like that, because there was some communication. But we tried to do our bit. But of course, to the ordinary Russian troop, it probably meant very little whether you were Jewish or whatever. I still know the Russian word is Hebraic from Hebrew. But I don't think they took that in.
Yeah. So you stayed there, living there for a little bit after liberation, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then when we got news that the Arrow Cross and the Germans left the other side of town where we knew the rest of our family used to live, and we assumed we were still there, we waited another few days for security, I suppose, to be on the safe side. And then we packed our meager belongings again. It was a 2-day, there was no transport, a 2-day walk just to get to the river. We stopped somewhere, and that I remember, in an apartment block in their basement, there were a couple of beds where the others told us the night before the Russians slept and the week before the Germans slept. But we were, after all the walking, we were delighted to get a bed and a pillow, which was luxury compared with the place where we stayed before. And now another day's walk. And when we got to the river, we found the Germans had blown up all the bridges, and the only way across was a makeshift ferry. There were in Budapest quite a well accepted summer exercise and entertainment was boating on the river, and some people brought out their leisure boats. These are tiny vehicles, if you want to call them that, with a couple of paddles, and for some kind of contribution they would offer their ferry services, which was quite hazardous because this is the time of the year, this is now late January, where ice slabs are floating on the river, and if you get hit by one of those, there's no guarantee that you survive. But we did get across, and the first family member we met was my grandmother, who by this time had news about the rest of the family, and we found out the sad story of everybody else in the family, at least the ones that she knew about, which was a more or less 2/3 or 3/4 loss. Hardly. I think only one male member of the family survived.
So were most of them killed by the fascists or sent to the camps, you know?
I don't know. I only later found or met one relative who had been to the camps. The rest, the men would have been in forced labor, except for my maternal grandfather, who found us this accommodation, because he just couldn't tolerate being. They were still in the Yellow Star House. Late in no, it was in December. He couldn't tolerate not being able to walk about. And despite my grandmother pleading with him, he went out for a walk and he never came back.
Okay.
So that's what happened to him and the other male members. And the female members, I know one of my father's sisters committed suicide to stop being taken on the train. And my father's and my uncle's aunt, who was the oldest member of the family, she contacted, I think it was also typhus, and passed away. So she escaped the worst. And my uncle Otto had to bury her in the middle of all this. And one of my aunts who survived went on Aliyah before the war, so she was one survivor. And the other one, I don't think I mentioned to you, the Hungarian Zionists had a very special role, and they entered into a negotiation with the Germans, and in a very unimaginable deal where Eichmann was offering what he called Blut gegen Waren, that was the German name, goods against blood. And he kind of believed that the Zionists they were part of this international Zionist conspiracy with secret contacts all over and access to money and high level political contacts. And he said, if you get me in touch with them, I'm willing to trade the remaining Hungarian Jews. This was when the Germans came into Hungary in March of 44. I'm willing to get into an agreement of trading the million lives still here, because Hungarian Jewry increased by this time from its 700 and 750,000 through escapees from Slovakia and Poland to nearly 1 million. So against a payment, I think he was looking for $1,000 per person for each of these, plus trucks and coffee and soap and the like, which he would promise to use on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, not against the Allies. And to test out this whole really harebrained, ridiculous scheme, he said we could assemble a trial trainload. And they started doing that. And I'm going into quite a bit of history, which I researched later. He sent one of the Zionist leaders from Hungary, called Hansi Brand, to Istanbul to meet with the Zionists from Palestine who were then hiding there, to discuss the deal. But the British thought, possibly rightly, that this was a way of setting the Allies against each other, them against the Russians, and they just imprisoned Hansi Brandt. But in the meantime, this sample train got assembled, and eventually 1,648 Jews got on the train. And my uncle was offered 3 places on that train, and he refused to go, and his wife refused to go. He said, I've got a job to do still in Hungary. But he put his daughter on the train. And so the daughter survived in Palestine and later in Israel. And just to complete the story, his wife, my Uncle Otto's wife, Lila, also survived in Budapest and managed to take with her my uncle's handwritten diary, which he kept every day, however brief, to Palestine. And I got hold of this a few years ago, translated it, and very recently managed to publish it, which is now becoming a historical memento.
What's the name of your book?
The book is called Orphans of the Holocaust, because one of the achievements of my uncle through the Red Cross, who employed him and gave him cover for a while, because later he got murdered by the Arrow Cross. But through the Red Cross, he set up 50 plus housing units for the abandoned Jewish children, and he managed to save 5,500 of them.
Wow.
So hence Orphans of the Holocaust.
Wow.
But the Arrow Cross got him in the end, even with the Swiss protection.
So he was involved, and he must have been a very, respected. You said he was in the military. And
He was a
had lot
decorated army captain,
right.
and he had exemptions from the Yellow Star, for example. He had contacts in the Hungarian government until the takeover by the Arrow Cross.
Okay.
And he met ministers, and he also met the Hungarian, however small it was, the Hungarian underground at the time, who wanted him to become post-war part of the Hungarian government. Dreams.
Yeah. Was there any resistance at that time in Hungary?
There was no armed resistance to speak about, which is a kind of sore point, because after the war, Hungarian Zionist activities were not rated very high, because their standard measure was Warsaw. And unless and until people managed to rise with guns and fight the fascists, you were not a martyr. Mm. And of course 70,000 perished in Warsaw. But in Hungary, the Zionists realized who were the only people really in the Jewish community who wanted to do something, that the best chance of survival was to play for time. And hence they got some hiding places, and equally importantly, they discovered that the Swiss in particular, and also some of the other neutrals, issued what they called Schutzpass, or a protective letter, with the name of a family on the letter, saying the person who carries this piece of paper is our citizen, but because of wartime we cannot issue them with a passport. Please respect them as a neutral citizen. And the young Zionists in Hungary got hold of some of these documents, set up illegal printing presses, and multiplied them literally by the tens of thousands. And quite a large number of people who carried these managed to survive. And we never had it, I and my family, but I know people. One of my best friends after the war showed me a letter to his father, wow, which was like that.
Amazing. So, getting back to your story, particularly, after liberation, where did you and your mother live?
Well, having met up with my grandmother, who survived again in a Yellow Star house, looking after an elderly lady in a reasonably sizable apartment, and she was not the only occupant there, and without a husband. And my mother and I, we couldn't get back to our pre-war home. I think my mother tried and only met with animosity. People by this time grabbed quite a lot of the furniture and stuff like that, and with police protection she managed to recover some of that. But we decided not to go back to old and bad memories, and moved in with my grandmother. And what my mother decided, using her high school training, to use that, and she got a bookkeeping job with a Jewish organization, and so she became, in our strange new family, the wage earner, and my grandmother became the housewife, looking after me and cooking and cleaning and all of that. So I have memory. It's not a brilliant existence because, again, my grandmother had to sleep on a settee in the living room, and my mother and I had to share a bedroom. But at least we each had one resting place, and we had our own kitchen and bathroom and toilet. And
So was it difficult? Were conditions difficult for a while?
conditions were very difficult. Even during the last few months of the Russian attack on Budapest, the food was virtually impossible to get. Anybody and everybody had to live on pulses. So staple food in the few months after liberation was yellow peas, beans, lentils, and I remember very well dried onions, because my grandmother would fry these up and put it on top of the lentils to give it a bit of interest and flavor. And the other food memory I have, the Russian artillery in those days was still not mechanized, or some of it, and they used horses to draw the guns. And these horses sometimes got injured in the street battles, and they butchered them in the middle of the street, and we would all rush out when we heard about this with pots and pans, and the soldiers would use a big axe or something and chop up the horse into bits and pieces, and you would run home and found ways of cooking horse meat, which actually is, well, I remember it as being quite pleasurable. We hadn't seen meat for months and months, and but the other aspect of our living conditions, of course, was that this apartment where my grandmother lived had been damaged by artillery fire, and one window facing the street was completely missing. So until somebody invented a way replacing glass, because there was no glass around, of brown paper being wrapping paper being soaked in oil and becoming semi-transparent, and this was stuck onto the window frames, and that allowed us to keep the wind out, not the cold. We lived in this apartment with virtually no heating. I'm now talking January, February 1945. So it was not idyllic existence. We lived like that for a few months.
So at what point did things start to get better?
Well, I really personally only know indirectly, because my mother was desperate to get me out of this and to get me a bit of education, and she found, I think, some kind of a Red Cross place in a suburb, where she managed to get me in. This is lodging, residential places. So I was there in a big dormitory, and at least she knew that I was fed and schooled. But I was quite unhappy there. I couldn't wait to get back with the family, which I did by the summer. Okay. And then I guess it must have been the autumn of 45, possibly 46, when schools restarted. I'm not too sure which year. And that was the first sign of normal life, really.
What do you remember about going to school? It must have been so strange.
Well, it was strange, and these became nationalized schools, So it was a mixed religious. And my strongest memory from this time is that there was when it came to religious education, some 70-80% of Hungarians are Catholic, Roman Catholic, and there are some other Christian religions, Lutheran or Reform, whatever they call themselves, evangelist, and Jews pre-war were 5 to 7%. Post-war it must have gone down dramatically. So anyway, when it came to the religious education in the school, it happened at least twice a week. They would say, other religions stand up, and you each have an allocated room somewhere in the building, and you go there to get your own bits and pieces, and the rest, the Catholics stayed in the main classroom. So immediately you were singled out, because the ones going to that room were the Jews. And what I also know, thinking back, that even amongst those kids, we never discussed that we were Jewish, and we certainly never discussed what happened to us in the preceding months. It took several decades when I met up with a couple of those boys in Canada, when we started talking about it, and how strange it is that we never communicated with each other as Jews. We each felt it was something best kept under wraps.
Sure, I can understand why.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, I think we're probably coming up to time to take another break. It's
Okay.
been an hour. So it goes by
Goodness.
so fast, doesn't it?
Okay.
So, but we are near the end now. We
Okay.
just have to talk about what happened after the war.
Yeah. Okay. It's only 10 years,
Yeah.
but it's quick to wrap up.
Quicker, I think, because, yeah, we have more of a record of that time. So,
Yes.
yeah. But we are still really interested in
Incidentally, you asked me if I have any visuals.
Yeah.
I have plenty, but I don't know what happened to the originals of those.
Oh.
I've got them all on the PC.
Okay.
So you're very welcome, either of you, to ask for copies of those. I could.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I think if you happen to have anything that you wanted to show, there's time to do that. But if you don't feel like you do, or it's not in the right format, that's no problem, you know.
Well, they're all JPEGs.
Yeah, then forget it. It's
Forget it.
no big
Okay.
deal. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Great. So we're going back now to when you were talking about starting school again after
Yeah.
after the war, and your life in the house there. What happened for you after that? You know, did you go through school on the same?
Well, it's a bit of a funny period. Nowadays, when I talk to people, sometimes jokingly say that I'm some kind of a political unique sample, because pre-war I lived under the fascist system. Post-war, very quickly the Hungarian situation, which started off as a democracy, turned into a socialist communist country. And then when I was lucky enough to get into Britain, I started a new existence in capitalism. So I've lived through all sorts. But to go to the particular question you were asking, because Hungary was occupied by the Soviets, although the initial move was to bring in free elections and democracy and several parties, and the vast majority was gained in the elections by so-called smallholders party, the peasant party, which is a big, agriculture in Hungary is an important aspect, or was. The peasants became the biggest, second biggest. The Social Democrats were number 3, and the Communists were number 4. And then that lasted no more than a couple of years. The Soviets then partly manipulated, partly enforced a system whereby they basically disintegrated, imprisoned many of the other party leaders, which left the Social Democrats and the Communists. They forced a merger between those two, and very quickly the Communists took over all the leading positions in the I think they called it the Workers' Party, and all the important government positions became the Communists, and they gave the notional position of president to the Social Democrat leader, and it became virtually a one-party system. And in order to succeed in any walk of life, you had to at least pay lip service to that system. And I found myself in a strange position where pre-war I was disadvantaged for being Jewish. Now anti-Semitism became illegal, but the only respected people in the country were the workers, and less so the peasants. Intellectuals were suspect but tolerated because they brought something useful to everyday life. But anybody who came from what they call a capitalist background, and my father, who had a scrap metal yard, became a bourgeois. So I was an undesirable individual. And the more I could do to pretend to be a good young socialist, the more I could pave my way even in the field of education. And so I became a young pioneer leader, and I performed on school occasions and all the rest of it. And even with all that, when it came to finishing primary school, I couldn't get a place in the more desirable high school, what they call a gymnasium in Hungarian. I could only go to a technical high school, which I finished, but fortunately that also gave you access to university education. And I, with a bit of push from one of my teachers who appreciated my position, and also because I took a leading position in the high school. I think they called it the Young Komsomol or something like this. And combined with the teacher's help and that position, I did manage to get a university place. And I completed 1 year at the Technical University, and when the second year started, I was pretty active then, and in sports and social circles, etc. And in October 56, while I was in my second year, there was a big student demonstration. Students realized that the practices of the so-called communist government were very far from the ideal of communist practices. There was no equality, no free speech. And they started demonstrations, tried to occupy the radio. The government got very scared. First, they brought in their own forces, including forces they had to take from the guarded borders, because Hungary had been completely isolated by the so-called Iron Curtain. And later they asked the Red Army to come back, and they quelled all these riots. And I started looking around and saw an opportunity to leave the country, as some 200,000 people did at the time. And if I really want to get to the bottom of it, my major push to go, although otherwise I might not have been so enterprising, was when during those riots I went onto the street. I found one of the Hungarian security guards hung on a lamppost by the, I won't call it, it wasn't the students, I'll explain that in a second, but on his chest was a big handwritten notice saying, "This will happen to every communist and every Jew." And why I say it wasn't the students, because during the winning days of the uprising, they came up with the idea of releasing political prisoners, not differentiating between prisoners put into prison because they were deviant communists and socialists, but also those who were still leftovers from the imprisoned Arrow Cross and fascist troops. And I think, and I'm firm in my own judgment in this, that these people actually, in the tail end of the uprising, took over control. And these were the people who came up with the anti-Jewish slogan. So when I saw that, I said, whichever way this is going to ultimately end, I've had enough. And there is an opportunity. We never had the opportunity before. So I managed to creep across the border. I was caught twice. And the third time I luckily got into Austria. And that's where my third phase of life started.
How did you said you got caught twice? How did this happen? Like you got turned away on the train or something like that? Or did you have to go on foot?
Well, the first couple of times I was optimistic enough to take a train. First time as close to the border as possible. Second time within 20 kilometers of the border. But the local authorities were aware of this, and I and others got arrested, put on a lorry and transported back to Budapest, marking my personal identity card, saying we'll deal with you later. But the third time I decided to have as long a walk as I could possibly do, and I had the address of somebody near the border who might show me the way to get across. And that's how I got there. And I actually started off with a woman and her child, and the three of us with the individual who lived there, taking us to cross the border. I don't know what would have happened to me had I had to go back to Hungary eventually.
Yeah.
because for 10 years I didn't dare to try that out.
So where did you go then?
I was in a kind of collection camp in one of the villages in Austria, and then I knew I wanted to make my way to Vienna, because somewhat miraculously my grandmother was one of the very first people in Hungary in '56 who actually got a legal permit and a passport to go notionally to visit relatives in Vienna, where she came from. And she actually left before the uprising, just a week or so before. It was sheer coincidence. And I had her address. So I wanted to, she stayed with her sister-in-law. And I came across somebody to whom I explained that if I could borrow some money, enough for a bus ticket to Vienna, I would repay the money, and they trusted me enough. And I actually turned up on their doorstep, and they took me under their wing. They gave me a bed, but I only stayed there. It wasn't big enough accommodation, and this was Christmas time, and the students were on vacation, and the student accommodation was vacated for refugee students by the Vienna local authority. And I got a place in one of those for a while. And later on, when the students came back, I had to go to a refugee camp. But all of this enabled me to try my luck in Vienna. That was the first time somebody said to me, forget now who it was, "You're Jewish, and there are some Jewish organizations here who offer special help." And I got some clothing, and up till then I lived on kind of toothbrush and public food handouts. But they gave me a little bit of spending money, and the authorities gave me a free travel pass on all Viennese transport. And then again there was a kind of bush telegraph set up. Every day you found out about some new possibilities. And somebody suggested to me that there were some scholarships, grants going around I could apply for, and gave me an address, and I went for an interview where they had a kind of minimal test. There was people from London University who came with one of their an important staff member and one of the lecturers who, for some reason, they had learned Hungarian, so he was the interpreter. And I obviously passed the verbal test that I'm up to a level of university education that I could be given a grant. And after several weeks, they said, we think we can put you on a transport to go to Britain, and we got you a visa. And that was my entry possibility to Britain.
So how old were you at this point?
How
old were you? Your age?
I was 20 years old.
20.
Yeah.
Wow. So you came to be a student studying engineering, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And where did you study? Where did they send you?
Well, initially we came on a special train together with other Hungarians. but people with this particular grant that I had, there was about 20 odd of us. We were in a separate coach on the train, and but we were all taken by the same train to the Midlands in England, into a converted army camp or RAF camp, just north of Birmingham. And from there I, well, cutting out unimportant details, eventually I was told that I would be going to Glasgow, to what then was called the Royal College of Science and Technology. But I first had to go to Edinburgh to study English.
Right.
And I was in Edinburgh from July to September, I think, or something, maybe August to September. And then transferred to Glasgow, and we were given, we were asked to open a bank account, and a monthly sum would be transferred to our bank account. So we were now in princely financial conditions.
So how did you feel? It must have been incredible for you.
It was a very good time. It really, felt totally liberated, looking forward to the next day and next week and next month. Everything was an adventure. And there was nothing to discourage me at any level. You could overcome everything. Well, looking back on it all, if I was lucky enough to overcome what went before, then certainly not having a particular type of food, which was definitely the case in England, there's nothing like what I used to eat. That certainly wasn't going to become a problem. It was another thrill, another adventure. Yeah, it was a good time.
Wonderful. And your mother was back in...
My mother was back in Hungary. She bravely said at the time, my grandmother was already in Vienna, and her son, my mother's brother, who had left before the war, was well established in East Africa at this time. He had joined the British Army, but that's another long story. But he was well established in Nairobi in Kenya, and said to her, "There's no way you're going back to Hungary. You're coming to me." And my mother stayed behind with that knowledge, saying to me that should you come back a third time, we can't afford not to give up the accommodation in case they catch me as well. Mm-hmm. So she stayed behind, and in fact, until I became a British citizen and with my first job, when I could provide assistance for her, she stayed in Hungary, and she joined me in 1964, I think.
So you came, was that, you had graduated from?
I graduated from Glasgow. I then found that I could extend my grant, and I went to do a master's degree in Birmingham for a year. And then the source of the grant was still flexible, and they gave me a chance for 3 years of postgraduate research in London. All in a reasonable income, nothing to shout about. I kept doing evening jobs in London to top up my income until I set up my own accommodation.
And what was your first job properly when you finished?
My first job was in those days a very big English multinational called the Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI for short. And I had decades with them that I eventually ended up with a pension from them.
Okay. And at what point did you move up to Wilmslow?
I didn't move here directly by any stretch of imagination. I had those spells in Birmingham and London, of course. Then the first job took me to a place in Hertfordshire, but I decided at that point that I liked London life so much that I would buy my first property, in fact, in North London, and commuted north day by day. And then that job required me to move several times. The job was in several disguises. First I went to Dumfries in Scotland, and then I moved to Cumbria, and then from Cumbria I came to this present place, which was kind of, by then I knew that ICI was likely to move me again and again. Mm. So I found Wilmslow as a kind of central focal point between 3 or 4 ICI locations, and that's why we settled here. And luckily, I actually ended up in 3 or 4 different work locations in every one of those that were possible.
Wow.
But I was in the right place and we didn't have to move.
And what year did you get married?
1966. Still in London.
I see. And what was your wife's maiden name?
The full name was Gillian Poulsen, but everybody calls her Jill, including me.
Great.
And she was studying to be a lawyer, and while we were still in London, she got her qualification.
So did you ever travel back to Hungary at this point?
As I briefly mentioned, for 10 years I wouldn't dare to. I was afraid of somebody saying, "You haven't done your military service, we keep you here." And then some people more brave than myself took the risk, and when they managed to get back to England, I said that it now may be safe to go. And I think I went back first in 1965.
Okay. And what was that like for you?
It was like being a celebrity. Everybody wanted to meet the man from England. And the meager scholar, I was partway between scholarship and job, or evening jobs, and I wasn't on a big income, but it was like a prince's income compared with Hungary, so I could afford everything, taking out everybody for meals and reunions, and it was quite pleasant.
So moving into your adult life in the UK, did you ever experience any anti-Semitism?
Well, I have to give you a bit more of a background on that, because you asked me about my wife.
Yeah.
When I met her, I very quickly discovered that she came from a very Jewish home, not Shomer Shabbat, funny enough, but a kosher home. So when we decided to get married, she said she couldn't have any other household but a kosher household. That was her condition. And we were keen enough on each other not to make this into a point of conflict. I said I probably couldn't bring too much to a family from my don't want to call it a moral background, but from let's call it just a secular background, I might as well accept hers. It's not so much of a sacrifice, and particularly when our children were born, the first one in 1971, second one in 1979. We also came to the decision that from the educational point of view, it brought a lot more to them to not to be secular. And so they were both brought up as kosher and with a great Jewish identity. So I now have a family. My two daughters have 7 children between them. And coming from my pre-war background, or even post-war background, to a family of 7 kosher grandchildren is quite an achievement.
That's remarkable.
And I'm very happy about it.
Yeah. So, I guess thinking back about your experiences in your early life, do you think that has had, I guess I'm wondering, what do you feel that the impact has been on you from a psychological perspective? Has it, did you have any difficulties because of those experiences ever, or did it?
Well, I can answer this question, and the one you asked just before, where I diverted from it. I haven't personally, I think I'm safe to say so, experienced any direct anti-Semitism. Anything that I have found is through media or discussions in groups sometimes, or the casual remark somebody makes to a third person somewhere. But my Jewish identity in those occasions, at those times, was not strong enough to actually go into battle over it if it wasn't aimed at me. But over the last maybe 7 or 8 years or so, with some what's the word on the tip of my tongue? Encouragement from somebody I met accidentally almost. I became very aware of my past. And as a result of that, I contacted the Holocaust Educational Trust in London to find out what it would take to join them as a spokesperson, as it were. And they very much welcomed me. They showed me how it is being done. I went out on a trial with one of their existing speakers to a school, and I was very encouraged by what I had seen, and I signed up, so to speak. And since then, 2016 it was, I think, I must have been to 80 or 90 schools, spoken to 20-something thousand children, and I'm nowadays very aware of what's going on politically, if you want to call it, or what happened in the Labour Party fairly recently, what's happening today to a lesser extent in the Liberal Party, to unfortunately a greater extent since the elections are coming up this week here, much to my disgust, with the Greens, and also in the newly emerging Reform Party in the UK, and I'm quite determined to call a spade as and when I see it.
So you are saying that you are seeing anti-Semitism in their language. You see that these parties are using anti-Semitic rhetoric in their...
I don't... Well, the Labour... I can't really say the party is using, but in terms of the Labour Party, some very senior members made declarations which can only be called anti-Semitic. And I'm glad to say that with the change of leader in the Labour Party, that has shifted considerably. I'm still concerned that if they become a dominant force in British politics, like winning this election, then they might tolerate anti-Semites more than they're doing at the moment. In the Reform Party, there have been some very nasty supporters being suddenly uncovered, and the same with the Greens. I can't go as far as saying the parties are becoming anti-Semitic. It's not like France.
Yeah. And obviously there's been a lot happening in Gaza recently. Have you seen a change in people's attitudes since
I have
then?
seen a lot of change in people's attitudes, and what to be honest, for example, in our street, there's one half Jewish couple, everybody else is not Jewish, and we put out a notice on our WhatsApp group saying if anybody wishes to talk to us about Gaza or what went before, we were very welcome. And we had some takers on that, and perfectly okay. But on the broader scale, and this is something that is upsetting me more than anything else, I come across, and there have been some very much advertised examples of that recently in the North London, forget the exact name, one of the synagogues, where they have several rabbis because it's supposed to be a diverse community. And the young American rabbi in that community came out with a statement calling Israelis criminals. And when that happens, I can only reply with one statement, which is if there is anything worse in my eyes than an anti-Semite, it's a Jewish anti-Semite. And I class that rabbi is a 30-year-old woman. I don't know where she picked up her ideas. She certainly won't have had a Holocaust survivor in her family because they would shut her up good and proper, I hope. But where she got her ideas from, I don't know, but I won't tolerate anybody like that.
So do you feel that I guess I'm wondering if you feel that the work that you're doing is going to help change these views.
I certainly hope so. When I speak to students in schools, but I have spoken to government departments, I have spoken on Holocaust Memorial Day to various community, not Jewish community, I mean local community organizations. I have spoken to the National Health Service England on a streamed call, so I'm happy to accept any challenge in that direction. But when I get questions, I'm certainly happy to face them and mention the same points that I just mentioned to you. And in terms of school children, I refer to my refugee story, and I refer to my my survival story, obviously, and to show them what it means to be picked up on, what it means to be supported, and encourage them to make their own choices, and hopefully in a positive direction.
Looking back on your experiences, what do you think it was that made you survive alone, maybe out of a group of children your age?
I think I owe it all to my mother, frankly. There's no question about it. And if I got one regret about that period, is that I was probably a late maturing child, and I never properly thanked her for what she'd done, even after she told me that story about escaping from the Arrow Cross. It was like, yes, well, it's old story about old times. I should have properly acknowledged her role in my and our survival. And that's a big piece of learning for me. And nowadays, if somebody does something for me, I always hasten to say that I know what it means, and thank them.
Has that experience affected your parenting, your relationship with your children?
Well, you would have to ask my children. I hope it would have. But again, it's not a regret anymore because it's being corrected well into their teens or even later. I never spoke to them about my experiences, and that was probably due to the usual teenage parent relationship. You bring up anything and they say, "Oh, don't bother me with that old story again." So I shut up. But certainly, since I started, this is my personal benefit from talking to schools, that I said it's just utterly ridiculous that I go and talk to total strangers every week, and I don't talk to my children and grandchildren. So I have been doing that in the last few years, and I was lucky enough in Manchester. There is an organization called the Federation of Jewish Services, who decided to assemble life stories of survivors, and they have created some 35 of these. These are big, thick books, and I had I think 25 interviews to contribute to this. And when it eventually got published, I bought 7 copies, and there is one. They gave me 2 for free for my daughters, and I bought 7 copies, and each of my grandchildren, who are, well, 5 or 7 are too young to talk to right now. The other 2 I talk to. But each of them, when they reach the age of about 16, they will receive their copy. So even when I'm not here, they have an opportunity to immerse themselves.
That's wonderful. Now, before we finish, I guess I'd like to know what you hope will come from sharing your story.
Well, I hope that I can't hope for a distinguishing mark to be put on this particular recording, but I would be very happy if I knew that some researcher, historian, Jewish or non-Jewish, picks up this recording and would manage to take out of it whatever bits and pieces may be useful for general publication. That would be great.
And when you share your story with the children at schools, what do you hope that they take away from your story?
I used to leave it to them, but from all the experience I had, nowadays, if it doesn't come up in their questions and answers, I always find a way of introducing this particular item, that in any event, whether it's bullying at school or racial discrimination or ethnic stuff anywhere, large scale or local, whatever, there are always three types of people around whom it's happening. There are the perpetrators, there are the victims, and there are, whatever you call them, the other participants or the onlookers. And each child that listens to me can take away from my talk that when they're in a situation like that, they have a choice to make, whether they want to side with the perpetrator, with the bully, or just say it's nothing much to do with me, I will let it pass, or go and support the person or the group who is being differentiated against or abused. And if they take away no more than that, then I will be very pleased.
Yeah, that's powerful. Is there anything else you would like to talk about that I haven't asked you about?
No, I think we have extracted as much as possible. Thank you.
Very much.
Well, thank you for doing the filming and the questioning and all.
Happy to do it.
Okay.